Broke single mom buys diapers with last dollar. The lonely CEO behind says, "Take more, bill's on me." "Ma'am, you're still short," the cashier said, and Monica felt her world crumble as she counted out her last dollar for diapers. But the black credit card that appeared beside her trembling hands belonged to the one man who could either save her or destroy her completely. Will Anderson had no idea the broken woman he was helping was the same woman his company had laid off 6 months earlier. When she discovers the truth, will their impossible love survive the weight of what he's done? Before we continue this wonderful story, click subscribe, like and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're listening from. Now let's get back to the story. The fluorescent lights of Henderson's grocery had been humming their tune of despair for exactly 9 hours and 47 minutes, when Monica Brown finally accepted that her life had become a mathematical equation with no solution. She stood in checkout lane 3, her 2-year-old son Aiden balanced on her hip, like a 25-pound reminder of everything she was fighting for, while his beloved giraffe toy dangled from her free hand like a flag of surrender. The numbers didn't lie, even when she desperately wanted them to. 1 pack of diapers, $12.99. Contents of her wallet, $11.47 in crumpled bills that looked as tired as she felt. Contents of her coat pocket, an assortment of coins that clinked together with all the musical charm of a funeral dirge. The mathematical gap between necessity and reality was exactly $1.52. Roughly the same distance, she thought grimly, as the space between her current existence and any semblance of the life she'd once imagined for herself. "Ma'am, you're still short," the cashier said, and Monica could hear the practiced gentleness in her voice that spoke of countless similar encounters. The young woman, probably 19, maybe 20, with the kind of fresh-faced optimism that Monica remembered having once upon a time, looked genuinely sorry to be the bearer of basic arithmetic. Monica felt her cheeks burn with the particular shame reserved for moments when pride collides headfirst with reality in front of an audience. The line behind her wasn't long, just one other customer, but it might as well have been a stadium full of people witnessing her failure to provide something as basic as diapers for her child. "I know," Monica whispered, shifting Aiden to her other hip and trying to ignore the way her lower back screamed in protest. 3 double shifts at the diner this week, plus a catering gig that had paid exactly half of what they'd promised, and she was still here, counting coins like some character from a Dickens novel. "Let me just." She reached into her coat pocket, fingers searching desperately through the collection of pennies, nickels, and dimes that represented the physical manifestation of her current circumstances. Each coin felt heavier than it should have, weighted with the knowledge that this was it. The bottom of the barrel, the end of the line, the place where pride goes to die a slow, public death. Behind her, completely unaware that he was about to become an unwitting participant in what would later seem like either divine intervention or cosmic irony, stood William Anderson. At 39, Will had the kind of success story that business magazines loved to feature in their 40 under 40 lists, complete with a penthouse apartment that overlooked the city like a glass monument to capitalism, and a net worth that had more digits than most people's social security numbers. What those magazines never mentioned, what Will himself rarely acknowledged, was that success, when measured purely in dollars and market share, could be the loneliest number of all. He'd come to Henderson's grocery at nearly 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, because his apartment had started feeling less like a home, and more like an expensive waiting room for an appointment that would never come. The Tesla in the parking lot, wedged between a minivan held together by prayer and duct tape, and a pickup truck that looked like it had survived several small wars, represented everything that was wrong with his life in one perfect metaphor. The pack of diapers in his cart wasn't random. They were the same brand his sister Emma had used for her daughter before the accident. The same cheerful yellow packaging, the same promise of gentle protection. The same price point that had once seemed insignificant, but now felt loaded with the weight of memories he couldn't quite process. Emma had been his tether to the real world, the one person who could look at his corner office and his stock options and still call him an idiot for working through Christmas. She died 18 months ago in the kind of mundane car accident that made insurance actuaries very good at their jobs, and everyone else question whether the universe had any sense of justice at all. Her daughter, Sophie, now lived with Emma's in-laws in Oregon, sending Will crayon drawings and voice messages that he treasured more than his quarterly profit reports. The diapers were supposed to be part of a care package, but standing in this fluorescent-lit cathedral of consumer necessity, Will realized he was really here because silence had become too expensive, even for someone who could afford everything else. He watched Monica count her coins with the careful precision of someone for whom every cent mattered, and something in the way her shoulders carried defeat reminded him viscerally of his own mother. 20 years ago, when the medical bills started arriving and dignity became a luxury they couldn't afford. He'd been 16 then, old enough to understand shame, but not old enough to do anything about it, watching his mother count out food stamps while pretending not to notice the judgment in other shoppers' eyes. "I can put something back," Monica said to the cashier, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying the weight of every compromise she'd ever had to make. Aidan chose that moment to reach for the candy display, his chubby fingers grasping for a chocolate bar like he was trying to grab happiness itself. "No, baby," Monica murmured, gently redirecting his hand, while simultaneously trying to figure out which necessity she could sacrifice. The diapers were non-negotiable, that much was clear. But maybe she could put back the loaf of bread, or the milk, or the jar of peanut butter that represented dinner for the next 3 days. The coins clinked onto the conveyor belt like a percussion section, playing the soundtrack to desperation. 47 cents in pennies, 30 cents in nickels, 25 cents in dimes. Not enough. Still not enough. Will felt something shift inside his chest, like a gear that had been stuck finally clicking into place. The sound of those coins hitting the belt was the same sound his mother's food stamps had made when they scattered across a grocery store counter 2 decades ago. And suddenly he was 16 again, watching the most important person in his world try to hold on to her dignity, while the math of poverty stripped it away piece by piece. "Let her take more," Will said, stepping forward and placing his Black American Express card on the counter with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of making decisions that affected hundreds of people. "Bill's on me." The words hung in the air like a challenge to the universe's apparent commitment to random cruelty. Monica turned to face him, and for a moment that stretched like taffy, they simply looked at each other. Two people from completely different worlds, suddenly connected by the universal language of human kindness. Monica's first instinct was to refuse. She'd learned early that help usually came with strings attached, that kindness from strangers often had interest rates that compounded daily. But something in the man's eyes stopped her from launching into her usual polite deflection. There was no pity there, no condescension, no look of superiority from someone slumming it with the less fortunate. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like recognition, as if he understood exactly where she was standing and how she'd gotten there. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of every kindness she'd been denied and every judgment she'd endured. Will's smile was the saddest thing she'd ever seen, like watching someone try to light a match in a hurricane. "Because once, someone did it for me," he said simply. "And maybe it saved my life." The cashier, who had clearly decided that she was not paid enough to question acts of unexpected generosity, began scanning Will's card with the efficiency of someone who had learned that the universe occasionally threw curveballs, and the best response was just to roll with them. "Take whatever you need," Will continued, gesturing toward the shelves around them. "Seriously, kids grow fast, right? Stock up." Monica felt tears threatening to spill over, but she blinked them back with the practiced ease of someone who had learned that crying was a luxury she couldn't afford in public. Instead, she found herself moving through the store like someone in a dream, adding items to her cart with the careful deliberation of someone unused to abundance, but wise enough not to abuse kindness. "Milk. Real milk," not the powdered substitute she'd been mixing with water. A loaf of bread that wasn't day-old markdown. Peanut butter that came in a jar bigger than her fist. Fruit snacks for Aiden that weren't generic store brand. Baby food that didn't require her to read the ingredients list and calculate nutritional value per penny. Will followed at a respectful distance, pushing his own nearly empty cart and trying to process what he was feeling. It wasn't the satisfaction of charity. He'd written enough tax-deductible checks to know what that felt like. This was something else entirely, something that felt less like giving and more like receiving. Every item Monica added to her cart seemed to add something to his own sense of purpose that had been missing for months. When they reconvened at the checkout, the total had climbed to $147.83. Will didn't blink. Monica tried not to hyperventilate. "This is too much," she said, even as she watched the cashier bag items that represented more abundance than she'd seen in months. "I can't possibly." "You're not taking anything from me," Will interrupted gently. "If anything, you're giving me something I haven't had in a while." "What's that?" "A reason to be in the right place at the right time." The receipt printed with a mechanical word that sounded like the universe exhaling. Monica took the bags with hands that shook slightly, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming sensation of kindness without conditions. "I don't even know your name," she said as they walked toward the exit, Aiden now fascinated by a new toy truck that had somehow made its way into one of the bags. "Will," he said, holding the door open for her. "Will Anderson." "Monica Brown," she replied. "And this is Aiden." They stood in the parking lot for a moment, two strangers who had somehow become something more in the space of a grocery store transaction. The night air was sharp with the promise of winter, but something about the moment felt warm, like standing in a pocket of kindness in an otherwise indifferent universe. "I don't know how to thank you," Monica said, and meant it. Will looked at her, then at Aiden, who was clutching his giraffe toy in one hand and reaching for the toy truck with the other, and felt something shift in his chest that he couldn't quite name. "You don't have to," he said. "But maybe we could grab coffee sometime. I mean, if you want to. No pressure. He paused, searching for words that didn't make him sound like either a creep or a patron saint. "I just don't meet a lot of real people in my line of work." Monica studied his face, looking for the catch that experience had taught her was always there. But all she saw was a man who looked as lonely as she felt tired, and something about that combination felt like the beginning of a conversation worth having. "I'd like that," she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. As they exchanged phone numbers under the fluorescent glow of the grocery store's exterior lights, neither of them realized they were standing at the beginning of something that would change both of their lives forever. Neither understood that what looked like a chance encounter was actually the first scene of a story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, class, and the particular courage required to let someone else carry you when you can no longer carry yourself. The plot twist was still weeks away, hidden behind tentative text messages and careful coffee dates, and the slow, terrifying process of learning to trust again. But for now, there was just this. Two people who had found each other in the checkout line of Henderson's grocery, teaching each other that kindness didn't require knowing someone's story. Sometimes, it just required recognizing their humanity. Monica drove home that night with a car full of groceries and a phone number she wasn't sure she'd have the courage to use. Will drove home to his empty penthouse with a receipt in his wallet and a feeling in his chest that he couldn't quite name, but definitely wanted to keep. Neither of them slept particularly well that night, but for the first time in months, it wasn't because they were worried about tomorrow. Monica Brown had always been suspicious of good things that happened without warning, the way some people were suspicious of free samples at the grocery store or politicians who smiled too much during election season. Experience had taught her that kindness from strangers usually came with invisible price tags that revealed themselves at the most inconvenient moments, like emotional parking meters that started charging compound interest just when you thought you'd found a safe place to rest. So when she woke up the morning after the Henderson's grocery incident, with Will Anderson's phone number still programmed into her phone, and a refrigerator actually full of food. Her first instinct was to wait for the other shoe to drop. The universe, in her experience, had a particularly twisted sense of humor when it came to giving her hope, and she'd learned to treat unexpected generosity the way a bomb squad treats suspicious packages, with extreme caution and the assumption that something was probably going to explode. "Mama, Nana," Aiden announced from his high chair, pointing at the actual bananas sitting in the actual fruit bowl on their actual kitchen counter. The sight of fresh fruit in her apartment was so surreal that Monica half expected it to disappear if she looked away too long, like some sort of grocery store mirage designed to torture people who usually shopped in the marked-down produce section. "Yes, baby, bananas," Monica confirmed, peeling one with the reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies. 2 days ago, fruit had been a luxury relegated to the maybe next week category of her mental grocery list, somewhere between organic anything and meals that don't come from a box. Now, watching Aiden's face light up as he smashed banana into his hair with the artistic dedication of a tiny, sticky Jackson Pollock, she felt something that might have been happiness if she'd been brave enough to call it that. The eviction notice was still tucked in her purse like a paper landmine, set to detonate in exactly 17 days if she couldn't come up with last month's rent, and a security deposit that collectively amounted to more money than she'd seen in one place since her divorce settlement ran out. But for the first time in weeks, the knot in her stomach had loosened enough for her to actually taste her coffee instead of just using it as a caffeine delivery system. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and Monica's heart performed a small gymnastics routine against her ribcage. She'd given Will her number the night before in a moment of sleep-deprived optimism, but the harsh light of morning had brought with it all the reasons why successful businessmen didn't typically befriend broke single mothers they met in grocery store checkout lines. "Good morning. Hope you and Aiden slept well. No pressure, but there's a coffee shop called Bean there. Done that on 5th Street if you're ever interested in that coffee we talked about. They have excellent Wi-Fi if you need to work, and I hear they're very kid-friendly. Will." Monica read the message 3 times, looking for the subtext that experience had taught her was always lurking beneath surface pleasantries. Men like Will Anderson, successful, well-dressed, apparently kind, didn't usually offer to buy groceries for strangers without expecting something in return. The fact that she couldn't figure out what that something might be made her more nervous, not less. "What do you think, baby?" she asked Aiden, who was now finger-painting the high-chair tray with banana residue. "Think the nice man who bought our groceries is actually nice? Or is this one of those situations where Mama's terrible judgment in men is about to rear its ugly head again?" Aiden responded by blowing a banana-scented raspberry, which Monica chose to interpret as sage advice to proceed with caution. She was still staring at her phone when it rang, displaying a number she didn't recognize, but that made her stomach perform another small acrobatic routine. For a wild moment, she wondered if Will had somehow developed psychic powers overnight, and was calling to discuss her internal debate about his text message. But when she answered, the voice on the other end belonged to Janet Morrison, her former supervisor at Creative Solutions Marketing. "Monica, honey, I have some news," Janet said, and something in her tone made Monica sit down heavily in the kitchen chair that wobbled slightly because she hadn't been able to afford to replace it after the divorce. "Remember that project you worked on before the layoffs? The Anderson Industries campaign." Monica felt the world tilt sideways like a carnival ride designed by someone with a cruel sense of humor. "Anderson Industries?" The CEO specifically asked about the work you did on their rebranding proposal. "Apparently, he was impressed with your portfolio, and he's looking for a freelance consultant for some upcoming projects. The pay would be—" Janet paused, and Monica could practically hear her trying to figure out how to deliver good news to someone who'd been living on bad news for months. "Well, let's just say it would be significantly better than what we were paying you here." "Anderson Industries," Monica repeated, because sometimes when the universe decides to play cosmic jokes, the only response is to repeat the punchline until it makes sense. "As in, William Anderson? You know him?" Monica looked across her kitchen at the groceries that Will Anderson had bought for her less than 12 hours ago, then at her phone, which was still displaying his text message about coffee shops and Wi-Fi and kid-friendly environments. The universe, apparently, had decided that subtlety was overrated and had moved on to orchestrating coincidences that would make a soap opera writer blush. "We've met," Monica said carefully, which was technically true in the same way that being struck by lightning was technically meeting electricity. "Perfect. He'd like to set up a meeting as soon as possible. Are you free this afternoon?" Monica glanced around her apartment, taking inventory of her current circumstances. Aidan was happily destroying a banana while wearing pajamas that actually fit him, thanks to Will's unexpected generosity. Her refrigerator was full, also thanks to Will. Her rent was still 17 days away from being catastrophically overdue. Her car was still making that grinding noise that suggested expensive repairs in the near future, and her bank account was still roughly as robust as a house of cards in a hurricane. But for the first time in months, she had fresh fruit and the possibility of actual employment that paid actual money. "I'll be there," she said. 3 hours later, Monica stood outside the gleaming glass tower that housed Anderson Industries, wearing her one good interview outfit, and trying to reconcile the man who'd bought her groceries with the CEO, who apparently owned a building that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought regular buildings weren't intimidating enough. The lobby alone probably cost more than her annual rent, all marble and chrome, and the kind of aggressive minimalism that screamed, "We have so much money that we can afford to not decorate." The elevator ride to the 37th floor gave her plenty of time to contemplate the various ways this meeting could go wrong. Best case scenario, Will Anderson was genuinely offering her work based on her qualifications, and the grocery store incident was just a cosmic coincidence. Worst case scenario, this was all some elaborate setup designed to. Actually, she couldn't figure out what the worst case scenario might be, which somehow made it worse. The receptionist, a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine and into a job that required her to be intimidatingly beautiful while answering phones, directed Monica to a conference room that had windows offering a view of the city that probably cost more per month than Monica made in a year. "Ms. Brown." Will Anderson appeared in the doorway, and Monica felt her carefully constructed professional composure wobble slightly. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of Henderson's grocery, he'd looked like an ordinary man doing an extraordinary kindness. Here, in his natural habitat of expensive suits and corner offices, he looked like exactly what he was. The kind of successful businessman who could buy grocery stores for fun and still have money left over for yacht payments. "Mr. Anderson," Monica replied, proud of herself for managing to sound professional despite the fact that her brain was trying to process the cognitive dissonance of seeing someone she'd met while counting coins now sitting behind a desk that probably cost more than her car. "Please call me Will," he said, and his smile was exactly the same as it had been the night before. Genuine, a little sad around the edges, and completely at odds with the corporate power suit and the office that looked like it had been featured in Architectural Digest. "I'm glad you could make it on such short notice." They sat across from each other at a conference table that could have hosted a small United Nations summit, and Monica tried to figure out how to navigate a conversation with someone who had seen her at her absolute lowest point less than 24 hours ago and was now potentially offering her professional salvation. "I want to be completely transparent," Will said, and Monica braced herself for the revelation that would make this whole situation make sense. "When Janet told me about your background and showed me your portfolio, I had no idea you were the same person I met last night. The work you did on our preliminary rebranding campaign was exceptional, innovative, thoughtful, exactly the kind of fresh perspective we need for our upcoming projects." Monica felt something that might have been relief if she'd been sure she wasn't about to wake up from a very elaborate dream. "So this isn't. I mean, the job offer isn't because of what happened at the store." Will's expression grew serious, and for a moment, Monica saw past the CEO facade to something that looked almost vulnerable. "Monica, I'm going to be honest with you about something. I've been successful in business partly because I've learned to trust my instincts about people. Last night, watching you in that store, seeing how you handled a difficult situation with grace and dignity, while putting your child's needs first, that told me more about your character than any—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "But I would never offer someone a job out of pity, and I would never insult your qualifications by suggesting that's what this is. You're here because you're good at what you do. The fact that we met under unusual circumstances is just, well, let's call it serendipity." Monica felt the tight knot in her chest loosen slightly. She'd spent so many months doubting her own worth, questioning whether the layoffs had happened because she wasn't good enough, wondering if she'd ever be anything more than a cautionary tale about single mothers trying to make it in a world designed for people who didn't have to choose between childcare and career advancement. What exactly would the work involve? She asked, and felt proud of herself for managing to sound like a professional instead of someone who'd been surviving on peanut butter sandwiches and hope. For the next hour, Will outlined a consulting project that sounded like everything Monica had dreamed of when she'd first gotten into marketing. Rebranding initiatives for Anderson Industries' charitable foundation, developing campaigns for their environmental sustainability programs, creating content that actually mattered instead of just trying to convince people to buy things they didn't need. The pay was more than she'd made in her last 3 months combined. The timeline was flexible, designed to accommodate someone who might need to work around other responsibilities, like, say, a 2-year-old who didn't believe in traditional business hours. The project was exactly the kind of work she'd gotten into marketing to do in the first place, before life had taught her to be grateful for any job that paid the bills. "There's one more thing," Will said as their meeting wound down. "The position comes with a signing bonus. Consider it an advance on future work, or a show of good faith, or just, well, consider it whatever makes you comfortable accepting it." He slid an envelope across the table, and Monica opened it with hands that only shook slightly. The check inside had enough zeros to cover her rent, her car repairs, and enough left over to buy Aiden the kind of Christmas she'd been afraid to even imagine. "This is too much," she said automatically, because accepting help had always been harder for her than needing it. "It's exactly what the work is worth," Will replied firmly. "And Monica, I know this situation is unusual, and I know you might have questions about my motivations. All I can tell you is that sometimes the universe puts people in each other's paths for reasons we don't understand right away. I'd like to think that's what happened here." Monica looked at the check, then at Will, then at the view of the city spread out below them like a promise of possibilities she'd almost forgotten existed. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt something that might have been hope if she'd been brave enough to call it that. "When do I start?" she asked. As she left Anderson Industries that afternoon with a contract in her purse and a future that looked suddenly, impossibly brighter, Monica realized that maybe the universe's sense of humor wasn't as twisted as she'd thought. Maybe sometimes, when you'd given up on expecting good things, the universe decided to surprise you with the kind of kindness that changed everything. Her phone buzzed with another text from Will. "How did the meeting go? Still interested in that coffee?" This time, when Monica smiled, it felt like something she might be able to get used to again. Been there, done that turned out to be the kind of coffee shop that existed in the narrow overlap between hipster enough to serve decent espresso and family-friendly enough that a toddler's inevitable meltdown wouldn't result in dirty looks from customers wearing scarves indoors. Monica arrived 15 minutes early because punctuality was one of the few things poverty hadn't been able to steal from her, and found Will already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee and what appeared to be a small arsenal of kid-friendly snacks. "You came prepared," Monica observed, settling Aiden into the high chair that Will had somehow procured while she'd been navigating the parking situation. A minor miracle in itself, since finding a parking space in downtown Portland on a Saturday morning typically required either divine intervention or a willingness to walk 17 blocks uphill in the rain. "I have a niece," Will explained, watching as Aiden immediately began investigating a packet of organic fruit pouches with the focused intensity of a tiny scientist discovering a new element. Well, had a niece. Still have, I suppose, but... He trailed off, and Monica caught a glimpse of something raw and unguarded, before his expression smoothed back into the careful pleasantness that seemed to be his default social setting. It's complicated, Monica finished, because she'd learned to recognize the particular way people's faces changed when they talked about family members who were present tense in their hearts, but past tense in their daily lives. Yeah, Will said, and the single word carried enough weight to suggest that complicated was putting it mildly. How's the new job feeling? Any regrets about working for the guy who's seen you count grocery store coins? Monica nearly choked on her coffee, which was significantly better than anything she'd been able to afford in recent months, and probably cost more per cup than she used to spend on caffeine in a week. Are you seriously asking me if I regret being offered financial stability by someone who's already proven he's not a complete sociopath? Because if so, your business instincts might need some calibration. Will laughed, and it was the first completely unguarded sound she'd heard him make. Fair enough. I just wanted to make sure this wasn't all feeling too. He gestured vaguely at the space between them, as if trying to capture the inherent weirdness of their situation. I don't know, charity adjacent. Trust me, Monica said, tearing open a pack of crackers for Aiden, who had moved on from fruit pouches and was now eyeing Will's coffee cup with the calculating expression of someone planning a hostile takeover. If I thought this was charity, we wouldn't be having coffee. I'd be at home, writing you a very polite thank you note, and pretending we'd never met. Good to know you have boundaries. I have so many boundaries that I practically need a map to navigate them, Monica replied. The fact that I'm here at all is basically a miracle of modern psychology. They fell into the kind of comfortable conversation that usually took weeks to develop, covering everything from Aiden's recent discovery that gravity worked on food as well as toys, to Will's ongoing battle with his penthouse apartment's smart home system, which apparently had opinions about his sleep schedule that it expressed through passive-aggressive lighting adjustments. So what's your story? Monica asked, watching as Aiden successfully negotiated the transfer of a cracker from his hand to his mouth without losing more than half of it to the floor. And I don't mean the Forbes magazine version. I mean the real story. What makes a successful CEO spend Tuesday nights buying diapers for strangers in grocery stores? Will was quiet for so long that Monica wondered if she'd crossed some invisible line drawn around the parts of his life that weren't available for casual coffee shop discussion. When he finally spoke, his voice had the careful quality of someone choosing words like he was defusing a bomb. My sister Emma died 18 months ago, he said. Car accident. She had a daughter, Sophie, who's 3 now. Lives with her grandparents in Oregon. He paused, staring into his coffee cup like it might contain answers to questions he hadn't figured out how to ask yet. Emma used to call me during board meetings, just to tell me about Sophie's latest adventures in creative destruction. She'd send me videos of Sophie singing songs she'd made up about dinosaurs, or pictures of art projects that looked like abstract expressionist interpretations of natural disasters. Monica felt something shift in her chest, the recognition of grief that had learned to wear different clothes, but never really changed its fundamental shape. She sounds like she was a good mom. The best, Will said simply. She had this way of making everything feel, I don't know, manageable. Like no matter how complicated life got, there was always someone who thought you were worth calling during important meetings to talk about toddler logic. And now, Will's smile was the saddest thing Monica had ever seen, like watching someone try to hold water in cupped hands. Now I have a penthouse apartment that cost more than most people's houses, and it's so quiet I can hear my own heartbeat echoing off the walls. I work 14-hour days, because empty spaces feel louder than boardrooms full of people arguing about quarterly projections. And sometimes I end up in grocery stores at 10 o'clock at night, buying diapers for my niece who lives 3 states away, because it's the only way I can figure out how to feel connected to the part of my life that actually mattered. Aiden chose that moment to drop his sippy cup, which hit the floor with the kind of plastic clatter that seemed designed to break uncomfortable silences. Will leaned down to retrieve it automatically, the gesture so natural that Monica realized he'd probably done the same thing countless times for Sophie. What about you? Will asked, settling back into his chair and handing Aiden the cup with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood toddler physics. What's the real story behind the woman who handles grocery store humiliation with more grace than most people handle minor inconveniences? Monica found herself telling him things she hadn't planned to share. About the marketing job she'd loved until the company decided that employee loyalty was less important than quarterly profit margins. About the divorce that had left her with primary custody of Aiden and roughly half the financial resources she'd been counting on. About the slow-motion catastrophe of being one missed paycheck away from losing everything while trying to maintain the illusion that she had everything under control. The hardest part, she said, watching Aiden methodically dismantle a graham cracker into component molecules, isn't being broke. It's being broke while having to pretend you're not broke. Because the moment people realize you're struggling, they start treating you like you've made poor life choices instead of like you've had poor life luck. There's a difference. A huge difference. Poor life choices implies that you deserve what you're getting, that you've somehow earned your circumstances through moral failings or character defects. Poor life luck acknowledges that sometimes the universe just decides to use you for target practice, and there's not much you can do except try to dodge the worst of it. Will nodded slowly, and Monica could see him processing the distinction. I think I've been on the lucky side of that equation for so long that I forgot it was an equation at all. Must be nice, Monica said, but without the bitterness that usually accompanied her observations about people whose biggest problems involved having too much money instead of too little. Lonelier than you'd think, Will replied. Success is like living in a glass house where everyone can see what you have, but nobody can see what you're missing. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Aiden attempt to feed graham cracker crumbs to his giraffe toy, with the focused concentration of someone who had recently discovered the concept of sharing and was determined to apply it to everything, including inanimate objects. Can I ask you something that might be completely inappropriate? Monica said. Given that we met while I was watching you count out grocery money, I think we've moved past traditional social boundaries. Why me? I mean, really. You could have helped anyone, bought groceries for any struggling parent, offered work to any unemployed marketing professional. What made you decide that I was worth the investment? Will considered the question for so long that Monica wondered if she'd asked something that didn't have an answer, or at least not one he was willing to share with someone he'd known for approximately 48 hours. You want the honest answer? He finally said. I want whatever answer you're willing to give. I've been successful because I'm good at reading people, at understanding what motivates them, what they need, what they're afraid of losing. Most people, when they're in desperate situations, they get smaller, defensive. They start making decisions based on scarcity instead of possibility. He paused, watching as Aiden succeeded in getting the giraffe to eat a piece of cracker. But you, standing in that checkout line, counting out your last dollar to buy diapers for your kid, you didn't get smaller. You got more determined, more focused. You handled crisis like someone who'd learned to treat obstacles as problems to solve instead of defeats to accept. Monica felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being seen clearly by someone who wasn't trying to fix her or pity her or turn her into a project for their own emotional satisfaction. Plus, Will added, and his grin had a slightly wicked edge that made him look less like a corporate executive and more like someone who might be fun to have drinks with. You told your toddler no to candy at the grocery store and made it stick. Do you have any idea how impressive that is? I've seen grown adults negotiate million-dollar contracts with less authority than you displayed in aisle 7. Monica laughed, surprising herself with how natural it felt. That's because million-dollar contracts don't involve sugar rushes and bedtime routines. Aiden's cute, but he's also a tiny dictator with very strong opinions about optimal candy distribution policies. Speaking of tiny dictators, Will said, how would you feel about bringing him to the office sometime? I mean, if you need to work and childcare falls through, or if you just want to show him where Mommy's new job is. We have a whole conference room that never gets used, and I'm pretty sure it's toddler-proof. Monica felt something warm and unexpected settle in her chest. like the first sip of coffee on a cold morning, or the feeling of finding exactly the right word after searching for it all day. Are you offering because you think I need help, or because you want to meet the tiny dictator responsible for my impressive authority in grocery store negotiations? Both, Will said, but mostly because that conference room has been sitting empty for 6 months, and I have a feeling it would be more useful as a temporary daycare center than as a monument to corporate excess. As they prepared to leave, Aidan having reached the natural conclusion of his snack-based entertainment and begun the preliminary negotiations for a nap, Monica realized that this was the first time in months she'd had a conversation with another adult that didn't involve comparing financial catastrophes or discussing the various ways the universe seemed determined to test their resilience. Same time next week, Will asked, helping her gather the debris field that always seemed to surround Aidan after any meal, regardless of location or duration. Only if you promise not to make this weird, Monica said. Define weird. Buying me things I can't afford, offering me opportunities one haven't earned, or generally treating me like a charity case you've adopted for tax purposes. Will's expression grew serious, and for a moment, Monica saw past the easy charm to something more complicated underneath. Monica, I can promise you that my motivations here have nothing to do with charity, and everything to do with the fact that you're the first person I've met in years who doesn't want something from me that I can buy with money. As Monica drove home that afternoon, Aidan sleeping peacefully in his car seat, and the radio playing songs that didn't sound like harbingers of doom for the first time in months, she realized that maybe trust wasn't something you decided to do all at once. Maybe it was something you built gradually, one coffee conversation at a time, until you woke up one day and discovered that letting someone help you hadn't destroyed your independence after all. Her phone buzzed with a text from Will. Thanks for coffee. Sophie would have loved meeting Aidan. Same time next week? Monica smiled as she typed back. Only if you bring better snacks. Aidan has standards. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the future felt like something worth planning, for instead of just something to survive. The Anderson Industries office building had begun to feel less like a glass monument to capitalism and more like a very expensive second home, which Monica found both comforting and mildly terrifying in equal measure. It had been 3 weeks since she'd started working on the rebranding project, and she'd fallen into a routine that felt dangerously close to sustainable. Something she'd learned not to trust, given the universe's apparent commitment to pulling the rug out from under her just when she started feeling steady on her feet. Mama work, Aidan announced from his portable throne, a high-tech stroller that Will had somehow procured after witnessing Aidan's first visit to the office, during which her son had treated the conference room like his personal playground and Will's expensive office furniture like a jungle gym designed for his entertainment. Yes, baby, Mama's working, Monica confirmed, setting up her laptop in what had become their unofficial space. The 37th floor conference room that Will had converted into what he called the most expensive daycare center in Portland, and she called proof that successful businessmen sometimes make decisions that would horrify their accountants. The room now contained a selection of toddler-appropriate furniture that had appeared gradually over the past few weeks, as if Will had been conducting some sort of stealth operation to make the space more Aidan-friendly without making a big production of it. There was a small table at exactly the right height for coloring, a bin of toys that rotated mysteriously every few days, and a corner that had been child-proofed with the kind of attention to detail that suggested Will had either done extensive research or had previous experience with tiny humans determined to find new and creative ways to injure themselves. Monica had stopped questioning the logistics of how he'd managed to transform a corporate conference room into a functional workspace for a single mother and her toddler, mostly because asking questions about Will's motivations had become increasingly complicated as she'd gotten to know him better. Every conversation revealed new layers of a man who seemed determined to use his success to solve problems for people who hadn't asked for his help, and she couldn't decide if that was admirable or concerning. Ms. Brown. Janet Morrison appeared in the doorway, looking like she was trying to solve a complex mathematical equation that involved Monica's presence in Anderson Industries' executive conference room. "I didn't expect to see you here. I thought you were working remotely on the foundation project." "I am working remotely," Monica said carefully, because explaining why the CEO of Anderson Industries had converted prime office real estate into a toddler-friendly workspace specifically for her convenience was the kind of conversation that required more social energy than she possessed before noon. "Just remotely from here. Sometimes, when childcare situations get complicated." Janet's expression suggested that she had thoughts about Monica's working arrangements that she was keeping to herself through sheer professional willpower. "And Mr. Anderson is comfortable with this arrangement?" "Mr. Anderson suggested it," Monica replied, which was technically true, even though the reality was more complicated than Janet's question allowed for. Well, hadn't just suggested it, he'd engineered it, with the same systematic approach he apparently brought to corporate acquisitions and hostile takeovers. "I see," Janet said, though her tone suggested that she didn't see at all, and that what she was seeing looked suspiciously like the kind of special treatment that made HR departments very nervous. "Well, I was hoping to discuss the timeline for the sustainability campaign materials. The board meeting is next week, and they'll want to see preliminary concepts." For the next hour, Monica found herself juggling a professional conversation about brand messaging and target demographics, while simultaneously managing Aiden's ongoing campaign to reorganize the toy bin according to principles known only to himself and possibly chaos theory. It was the kind of multitasking that had become second nature during her months of unemployment, when every phone interview had been conducted while entertaining a toddler who didn't understand the concept of "mommy needs 5 minutes of quiet" to convince someone she's a functional adult. Janet left looking vaguely bemused, and Monica was just settling back into her work when Will appeared in the doorway carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd just received either very good news or very bad news, and wasn't sure which category it fell into. "We need to talk," he said, which were the 4 words that had preceded every major catastrophe in Monica's adult life, from her divorce to her layoff to the conversation with her landlord about the creative interpretation of on-time rent payments. "That's never good," Monica said, automatically saving her work because experience had taught her that preparing for the worst was usually more efficient than hoping for the best. "It's not bad," Will said quickly. "At least, I don't think it's bad. But it's complicated." He handed her one of the coffee cups and sat down across from her at the small table, looking like he was trying to figure out how to explain quantum physics to someone whose highest math education had stopped at statistics for marketing professionals. "Define complicated," Monica said, because in her experience, when successful businessmen described situations as complicated, it usually meant that someone was about to get screwed, and it probably wasn't going to be the successful businessman. "The board meeting I mentioned? The one where they're reviewing the foundation's rebranding campaign." Will paused, seeming to choose his words with the care of someone defusing a bomb. "They want to meet you, personally, to discuss your vision for the project and get a sense of your long-term availability for additional consulting work." Monica felt her stomach perform the familiar gymnastics routine that accompanied any situation involving people with more power than her making decisions about her professional future. "That's good, right? I mean, if they like my work enough to want to meet me, that suggests the project is going well." "It is going well. Better than well, actually. The preliminary materials you've developed are exactly what we've been looking for. Innovative, authentic, the kind of messaging that actually makes people care about environmental sustainability, instead of just making them feel guilty about their carbon footprint." "But," Monica prompted, because she'd learned to recognize the particular pause that preceded information designed to complicate her life in new and creative ways. Will took a deep breath that suggested he was about to deliver news that would require her to recalibrate her entire understanding of her current situation. "But the board doesn't know about our personal connection. The grocery store, the coffee meetings, the fact that I've essentially converted a conference room into your private office. As far as they know, you're a consulting professional I hired based solely on your qualifications and portfolio. Monica felt the world tilt slightly, like a carnival ride designed by someone with a particularly twisted sense of humor. And if they find out that you hired someone you met while she was counting grocery money, they'll assume that my judgment has been compromised by personal feelings, and they'll question whether the work you've produced is actually as good as it appears, or whether I've been blinded by. Will trailed off, looking like he was trying to find a diplomatic way to say something inherently undiplomatic. By pity for the poor single mother you decided to rescue? Monica finished, and she was proud of herself for managing to keep her voice level despite the fact that her chest felt like someone had wrapped it in barbed wire. I was going to say by personal investment in your success that goes beyond professional considerations, Will said carefully. But your version is probably what they'd actually think. Monica set down her coffee cup with hands that shook slightly, not from anger, but from the familiar sensation of having the ground shift underneath her, just when she'd started to believe she was standing on solid footing. So what you're telling me is that I need to pretend we don't know each other outside of this professional context. That the grocery store never happened, that we've never had coffee, that you've never met Aiden. I'm telling you that the board meeting will go better if they focus on your qualifications instead of speculating about my motivations. Will said, and Monica could see him trying to find words that would make this conversation feel less like a betrayal than it currently did. And after the board meeting? Do we go back to being strangers? Or do we just make sure we never mention how we actually met? Will was quiet for so long that Monica wondered if she'd asked a question that didn't have an answer, or at least not one he was prepared to give. When he finally spoke, his voice had the careful quality of someone walking through a minefield while blindfolded. Monica, what I'm about to say is probably going to sound either completely insane or utterly manipulative, and I need you to know that it's neither. He paused, seeming to gather courage for whatever he was about to reveal. I don't want to go back to being strangers. These past few weeks, working with you, watching Aiden turn my sterile conference room into something that actually feels alive, it's been the first time since Emma died that I've felt like my life had a point beyond just accumulating wealth and impressing people I don't particularly like. Monica felt something shift in her chest, like a piece of armor she'd been wearing for so long she'd forgotten it was there suddenly becoming visible. Will, let me finish, he said quickly. I know this situation is complicated, and I know there are power dynamics here that make everything potentially problematic. I know that you might think I'm some rich guy trying to buy his way into feeling good about himself, or that I'm confusing gratitude for affection, or that I'm just lonely enough to mistake professional collaboration for personal connection. Are you? Monica asked, because sometimes the only way to navigate complicated conversations was to ask the questions that made everyone uncomfortable. I don't know, Will admitted, and his honesty hit her like cold water. I know that I look forward to Monday mornings for the first time in years, because it means you'll be here working on projects that actually matter. I know that watching you handle single motherhood and career rebuilding with more grace than I've ever managed to handle a quarterly profit decline makes me want to be better at being human. And I know that when Aiden calls me Will, and shows me pictures he's colored, I feel more useful than I do when I'm approving million-dollar acquisitions. Monica looked across the table at this man who had somehow become central to her life in the space of a few weeks, trying to figure out how to respond to a confession that was equal parts sweet and terrifying. Aiden chose that moment to wander over from his toy corner and climb into Will's lap with the casual confidence of someone who had never learned to doubt his welcome anywhere. Will sad? Aiden asked, patting Will's face with the gentle concern of someone who had recently discovered that grown-ups sometimes needed comfort too. Not sad, buddy, Will said, settling Aiden more comfortably and accepting the giraffe toy that Aiden offered as either a gift or a consultation tool. Just thinking about grown-up stuff that doesn't make as much sense as it should. Thinking hard? Aiden asked sympathetically. Very hard, Will confirmed. Monica watched this interaction with the strange sensation of seeing her life from outside herself, like she was watching a movie about someone else's complicated romantic situation and trying to figure out how it would end. The man holding her son with easy familiarity was the same person who owned the building they were sitting in, who could probably buy her apartment complex without affecting his monthly budget, who had pulled her back from the edge of financial disaster with the casual generosity of someone who didn't have to calculate the cost of kindness. It should have felt like a fairy tale, or at least like the kind of story that ended with wedding bells and happily ever after. But Monica had learned to be suspicious of fairy tales, especially ones that required her to pretend that power imbalances didn't exist or that good intentions were sufficient to overcome structural inequality. "What happens after the board meeting?" she asked finally. "That depends," Will said, lifting Aiden so he could see out the window at the city spread below them. "What do you want to happen?" Monica looked at them, Will pointing out landmarks to Aiden, her son chattering about birds and buildings with the enthusiasm of someone discovering that the world was full of interesting things, and realized that what she wanted was exactly what she was afraid to want. Stability that didn't require her to sacrifice her independence, kindness that didn't come with invisible price tags, and the possibility that trust might be something she could afford after all. "I want to not have to choose between my professional integrity and my personal happiness," she said finally. "Then we'll figure out how to make that possible," Will replied, as if complex social and economic dynamics were just another business problem that could be solved with sufficient planning and good faith. Monica hoped he was right, because the alternative, going back to counting grocery money, while pretending that the past few weeks had been a temporary reprieve from reality instead of a glimpse of what life could look like when the universe decided to be kind, was too depressing to contemplate. "Mama, will snack time," Aiden announced, apparently having solved the grown-up conversation through the simple expedient of changing the subject to something more immediately relevant. "Out of the mouths of babes," Will said, grinning. "Come on, I know where they keep the good cookies in this place." As they headed toward the executive kitchen, Aiden riding on Will's shoulders and Monica trying to process everything that had just happened, she realized that maybe trust wasn't about having all the answers up front. Maybe it was about being willing to figure out the complicated parts together, one conversation at a time. The Anderson Industries boardroom was the kind of space designed to make people feel simultaneously impressed and intimidated, which Monica suspected was exactly the point. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Portland that probably cost more in property taxes than she made in a year, and the conference table looked like it had been carved from a single piece of wood by craftsmen who charged by the hour and took their time about it. Monica sat at one end of the table, her portfolio spread in front of her with the careful precision of someone who had learned that presentation mattered almost as much as content, trying to project the kind of professional confidence that would convince a room full of executives that she belonged here. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to present a campaign about authentic corporate responsibility, while actively concealing the authentic circumstances of how she'd gotten this job in the first place. Will sat at the other end of the table, wearing his CEO face, the expression of polite professional interest that revealed nothing about the fact that they'd spent the previous evening teaching Aiden how to build block towers in what was rapidly becoming the most expensive playroom in downtown Portland. Monica had to admire his poker face. If she hadn't known better, she would have assumed they were complete strangers meeting for the first time in a professional context. The board members filed in with the collective energy of people who were accustomed to making decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars, and who took that responsibility seriously enough to wear it like expensive armor. Monica recognized the type from her previous corporate life. Smart, successful, generally well-intentioned, but operating from a level of financial security that made it difficult to understand what real desperation actually looked like. "Ladies and gentlemen," Will began, and his voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of running meetings where his word was literally the final word on everything from quarterly projections to office coffee vendors. "I'd like you to meet Monica Brown, the consulting professional who's been developing our foundation's new branding strategy. Monica, please meet our board of directors." The introductions were a blur of handshakes and business cards, names that Monica tried to memorize while simultaneously calculating how much combined wealth was represented in this room. Probably enough to solve poverty in several small countries, or at least enough to make a serious dent in the student loan debt crisis. "Ms. Brown," said Margaret Chen, the board chair, settling into her seat with the efficient grace of someone who had learned to command attention without raising her voice. "We've been very impressed with the preliminary materials you've developed. The messaging feels fresh and authentic in a way that corporate environmental campaigns often struggle to achieve." "Thank you," Monica replied, trying to strike the right balance between confident and humble. "I think the key is focusing on specific, measurable impacts rather than abstract concepts. People respond better to 'we've planted 50,000 trees' than to 'we care about the environment.'" For the next hour, Monica presented her work with the kind of detailed analysis that she'd been perfecting during her weeks in Will's conference room, while Aidan had napped or played quietly in the corner. The campaign she'd developed focused on Anderson Industries' actual environmental initiatives, renewable energy investments, waste reduction programs, partnerships with conservation organizations, rather than the kind of vague corporate speak that made people feel good without actually meaning anything. "This is exactly the direction we've been hoping to move in," said James Rodriguez, the board's financial officer, studying the mock-ups of print advertisements that managed to be both visually striking and factually substantive. "How do you see this campaign scaling across different media platforms?" Monica launched into her prepared presentation about digital strategy and target demographics, feeling increasingly confident as the board members asked increasingly detailed questions about implementation timelines and budget considerations. This was what she was good at, taking complex ideas and finding ways to communicate them clearly to people who might not initially care, but could be convinced to if you approached them the right way. "One question," said Patricia Williams, the board member who served as liaison to Anderson Industries' charitable foundation. "Your background shows extensive experience with corporate marketing, but this campaign has a level of social consciousness that suggests more personal investment than typical consulting work. What drew you to focus on environmental and social responsibility messaging?" Monica felt the question like a trap disguised as curiosity, and for a moment she wondered if Patricia had somehow discovered the connection between her and Will that they'd worked so carefully to conceal. But looking at the woman's expression, Monica realized this was just the kind of probing question that board members asked when they wanted to understand whether a consultant truly understood their mission or was just telling them what they wanted to hear. "Honestly," Monica said, deciding that partial truth was probably safer than complete fabrication. "Because I have a 2-year-old son, and I've spent a lot of time recently thinking about what kind of world we're leaving for the next generation. It's easy to talk about corporate responsibility in abstract terms, but when you're looking at your child and trying to explain why the planet is getting hotter and the oceans are getting dirtier, abstract concepts become very personal very quickly." She could see Will's expression soften slightly at the mention of Aidan, and for a moment their eyes met across the conference table in a look of shared understanding that probably lasted exactly long enough to be professionally inappropriate. "That's exactly the kind of authentic perspective we need," Margaret said approvingly. "Too many corporate campaigns feel like they were developed by people who've never had to worry about the real-world implications of environmental degradation." The presentation continued for another 30 minutes, covering budget projections and timeline expectations, and the kind of logistical details that made Monica grateful for her years of corporate experience. When it was over, the board members spent several minutes discussing her proposals in the kind of abbreviated professional code that people develop when they've been making decisions together for years. "Ms. Brown," Margaret finally said, "we'd like to offer you an extended consulting contract. 6 months initially, with the possibility of renewal if the campaign performs as well as we expect it to. The compensation would be..." She named a figure that made Monica's chest tighten with relief, and something that might have been joy if she'd been brave enough to call it that. "That's very generous," Monica managed, trying to sound professional despite the fact that her brain was calculating how many months of rent and car payments and grocery bills the contract would cover. Financial security was starting to feel like a real possibility instead of just something she fantasized about during her most optimistic moments. "There is one condition," Patricia added, and Monica felt her stomach perform the familiar drop that accompanied unexpected complications. "Given the scope of the project and the timeline we're working with, we'd prefer if you could work primarily on-site rather than remotely. We've found that creative projects benefit from the kind of collaboration and resource access that's difficult to maintain from a distance." Monica glanced at Will, who was wearing the careful expression of someone trying not to influence a conversation he desperately wanted to control. The board didn't know about Aiden's frequent presence in the conference room, or about the way Will had gradually transformed that space into the most expensive daycare center in downtown Portland. As far as they were concerned, she was a consulting professional who could work normal business hours in a normal office environment without any of the complications that came with single parenthood. "On-site work would be fine," Monica said carefully, "though I should mention that I occasionally have childcare situations that might require some scheduling flexibility." "Of course," Margaret said with the understanding nod of someone who had probably never had to choose between attending a work meeting and staying home with a sick child. "We're all parents here. We understand that life happens." Monica doubted that any of them understood the specific variety of life that happened when you were a single mother working without the safety net of extended family or reliable childcare, but she appreciated the gesture of acknowledgement. "When would you like me to start?" she asked. "Immediately, if possible," James replied. "The campaign launch is scheduled for the first quarter of next year, and we'll need to have all materials finalized and tested by the end of December." As the meeting concluded and board members began gathering their materials and checking their phones for whatever crisis was next on their respective schedules, Monica felt the familiar mixture of excitement and terror that accompanied new opportunities. The contract represented more financial stability than she'd had since before her divorce, but it also meant committing to a professional relationship with Will that would require them to maintain their carefully constructed facade of purely business interactions. "Ms. Brown," Will said as the room emptied, his voice carrying the formal tone he'd maintained throughout the meeting. "Could you stay for a few minutes? I'd like to discuss some logistical details about your workspace and project timeline." When they were alone, the carefully maintained professional distance between them seemed to collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. Will leaned back in his chair and ran his hands through his hair with the exhausted gesture of someone who'd been performing a role that didn't quite fit. "That went well," Monica said, trying to break the tension that had settled over them like fog. "Better than well," Will replied. They were genuinely impressed. "The campaign you've developed is exactly what this company needs, and they can see that." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "The question is, how do you feel about spending the next 6 months pretending we're nothing more than professional colleagues?" Monica considered the question while looking around the boardroom that represented everything she'd been working toward for months. Financial stability, professional respect, the kind of career opportunity that could change her entire trajectory. Then she thought about Aiden in Will's arms, calling him Will, with the casual affection of someone who had never learned to doubt his welcome anywhere. "I think," she said finally, "that I'm willing to figure out how to make it work, because the alternative is giving up the best job opportunity I've had in years, and probably the most interesting man I've met in longer than that." Will's smile was the first completely unguarded expression he'd worn since the board members had entered the room. "So we're doing this?" The whole elaborate professional charade, while trying to figure out what's actually happening between us. "Apparently," Monica said, and found herself smiling back despite the complexity of everything they were agreeing to navigate. "Though I have to warn you, maintaining professional boundaries while your conference room doubles as my son's playroom is going to require some serious logistical creativity." "Good thing I'm good at logistics," Will replied, and something in his tone suggested that he was looking forward to the challenge of solving problems that were more personally meaningful than quarterly profit projections. As they left the boardroom together, maintaining the careful distance of professional colleagues, while sharing looks that suggested significantly more personal investment, Monica realized that maybe the most complicated situations were also sometimes the most worthwhile ones. The trick was learning to navigate the complexity without losing sight of what actually mattered. And what mattered, she was beginning to realize, was the possibility that trust and financial security and something that might eventually be called love could all coexist in the same space, if you were brave enough to let them. The elevator ride down to the 37th floor was silent, but it was the comfortable kind of silence that came from understanding that some conversations were too important to rush, even when you were trapped in a small metal box with someone whose presence made you question everything you thought you knew about the difference between professional and personal boundaries. Same time tomorrow? Will asked as the elevator doors opened. Wouldn't miss it, Monica replied, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in months. 3 weeks into her extended consulting contract, Monica had developed what she privately called corporate schizophrenia, the ability to seamlessly transition between being Monica the professional consultant during official business hours and Monica the woman whose toddler had somehow convinced to install a miniature slide in his conference room during the increasingly frequent moments when the lines between work and life blurred beyond recognition. The slide had appeared on a Thursday morning, assembled with the kind of precision that suggested Will had either hired professional playground installers or had spent several hours the night before following instruction manuals written by people who assumed everyone owned a full set of power tools. Monica had arrived to find Aidan staring at it with the reverent expression usually reserved for Christmas morning or the discovery of hidden candy. "You bought my son playground equipment," Monica said, "because sometimes when the universe decided to test your ability to process surreal situations, the only response was to state the obvious and hope it started making sense eventually. I researched age-appropriate indoor play structures." Will replied with the matter-of-fact tone he usually reserved for discussing quarterly projections. "The safety ratings on this particular model are excellent, and it's designed to fit in corporate environments without disrupting the professional aesthetic." Monica looked around the conference room, which now contained a toddler slide, a toy kitchen that probably cost more than her actual kitchen, and a reading corner that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood that 2-year-olds had very specific opinions about optimal book fork construction. "Will," she said carefully, "this has moved beyond kid-friendly workspace and into elaborate playroom disguised as a conference room. People are going to notice. People aren't supposed to be in this conference room," Will pointed out. "It's been designated as your private workspace for the duration of your consulting contract. Anyone who has questions about the interior decorating choices can discuss them with me directly. And you're comfortable explaining to your board of directors why you've converted prime office real estate into what appears to be a very expensive daycare center?" Will's expression grew thoughtful in the way that usually preceded decisions that made perfect sense to him and no sense to anyone else. "Monica, do you know what this conference room was used for before you started working here? Important corporate meetings involving people who wear expensive suits and make decisions about other people's financial futures?" "Storage," Will said. "Specifically, storage for office furniture that nobody wanted, but everyone was afraid to throw away because it might be needed someday. The most productive this room has been in the past 5 years was when the cleaning crew used it to store vacuum cleaners." Monica felt something shift in her understanding of their situation, like a puzzle piece finally clicking into place. "So you're telling me that converting an used storage space into a functional workspace that happens to accommodate a toddler is actually a more efficient use of corporate resources than whatever was happening here before?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Will replied, and his grin had the slightly wicked edge that made him look less like a corporate executive and more like someone who enjoyed finding creative solutions to bureaucratic problems. "Plus, have you seen the quality of work you've been producing since you started bringing Aidan here? The environmental campaign materials you finished last week are some of the best marketing content this company has ever commissioned." It was true, and Monica had been trying not to think too hard about why that might be. Working in an environment where she didn't have to choose between professional obligations and parental responsibilities had freed up mental energy she'd forgotten she possessed. When she wasn't constantly calculating childcare logistics or feeling guilty about leaving Aiden with babysitters who cost more per hour than she used to make, she could focus on the kind of creative problem-solving that had made her good at her job in the first place. "Mama slide," Aiden announced, having completed his initial inspection of the new playground equipment and reached the inevitable conclusion that it required immediate testing. Monica watched him climb the small ladder with the focused determination of someone conducting important scientific research into the relationship between gravity and fun. "He's getting good at that," Will observed, settling into one of the chairs they'd positioned to provide optimal slide supervision sightlines. "Last week he needed help with the ladder." 2-year-olds are basically tiny scientists conducting ongoing experiments in physical development, Monica replied, pulling out her laptop and trying to transition back into professional mode despite the fact that her work environment now included sound effects that were distinctly playground adjacent. Every day they wake up slightly more capable of reaching things they shouldn't touch and climbing objects that weren't designed for climbing. "Sounds exhausting." "It is," Monica said, and was surprised by how much relief she felt at being able to acknowledge that truth to someone who didn't immediately follow it up with helpful suggestions about sleep schedules or time management. "But it's also incredible, watching someone discover that the world is full of possibilities they hadn't imagined the day before." They fell into the comfortable working rhythm they'd developed over the past few weeks, Monica focusing on campaign materials, while Will handled whatever mysterious executive responsibilities filled his days, with periodic interruptions from Aiden, who had appointed himself the unofficial quality control manager for all slide-related activities. It was during one of these interruptions that Monica's phone buzzed with a call from Janet Morrison, and she felt her stomach perform the familiar gymnastics routine that accompanied unexpected contact from her former supervisor. "Monica, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," Janet said, though her tone suggested that she assumed nothing Monica might be doing could be more important than taking her call. "Just working on the Anderson Industries project," Monica replied carefully, glancing at Will, who was helping Aiden construct an elaborate block tower while pretending not to eavesdrop on her conversation. "That's actually why I'm calling. I've been hearing interesting things about your work there. Word is that you've impressed some very important people, and there might be opportunities for expanded collaboration." Monica felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office air conditioning. "What kind of opportunities?" "Well, apparently your environmental campaign has caught the attention of other companies in Anderson Industries' corporate network. There's talk of you consulting on similar projects for their subsidiaries, maybe even developing a specialized practice in corporate social responsibility messaging." It should have felt like good news, the kind of professional validation that Monica had been working toward for years. But something in Janet's tone suggested that this conversation was heading in a direction that would complicate her life in new and creative ways. "That sounds promising," Monica said cautiously. "It is promising. In fact, it's the kind of opportunity that could set you up as a leading consultant in your field, with the right kind of professional support and business development resources." Janet paused, and Monica could practically hear her shifting into sales mode. "Which is why I wanted to discuss the possibility of you returning to Creative Solutions Marketing as a senior consultant. We could provide the infrastructure and client management support you'd need to handle larger corporate accounts." Monica felt the world tilt slightly, like a carnival ride designed by someone with a particularly twisted sense of humor. "Janet, Creative Solutions Marketing laid me off 6 months ago because they couldn't afford to keep me on staff. That was a temporary financial adjustment," Janet replied with the smooth confidence of someone revising history in real time. "The company has since restructured, and we're in a position to bring back our most talented former employees in expanded roles. Your work with Anderson Industries has demonstrated exactly the kind of high-level corporate consulting capabilities we want to build our reputation around." Monica looked around the conference room that had become her office, at Aiden playing contentedly with toys that Will had somehow procured without making a big production of it, at the view of Portland spread out below them like a promise of possibilities she was just beginning to believe she might deserve. "I appreciate the offer," she said finally, "but I'm happy with my current working arrangements." "Monica," Janet said, and her voice carried the particular patience usually reserved for explaining obvious facts to people who were being deliberately obtuse. "I understand that consulting work can feel liberating, but it doesn't provide the kind of long-term security that comes with permanent employment. Anderson Industries might be a wonderful client, but client relationships are inherently temporary. What happens when the project ends?" It was a fair question, and one that Monica had been trying not to think about too directly. Her contract with Anderson Industries was for 6 months, with the possibility of renewal, but no guarantee. What happened after that depended on variables she couldn't control. The success of the environmental campaign, the board's satisfaction with her work, and the complex personal relationship with Will that existed in the spaces between their professional obligations. "I'll figure that out when I get there," Monica said, which was probably not the most professionally strategic response she could have given. "Monica, be practical. Creative Solutions Marketing is offering you security, benefits, a career trajectory that doesn't depend on maintaining relationships with individual clients. Why would you choose uncertainty when you could have stability?" Because, Monica thought but didn't say, stability that requires her to pretend the past few months hadn't happened felt less like security and more like a different kind of trap. Because working in an environment where she didn't have to choose between professional obligations and parental responsibilities had reminded her of what it felt like to be good at her job instead of just grateful to have one. Because walking away from Will and Aiden's friendship for the promise of corporate security felt like exactly the kind of practical decision that would make perfect sense and leave her completely miserable. "Let me think about it," she said instead. After she hung up, Monica sat staring at her phone while Aiden continued his slide-based research project, and Will pretended to be absorbed in email, while obviously waiting for her to share whatever had just complicated her day. "Problem?" he asked finally. "Maybe," Monica replied. "Or maybe an opportunity. I'm not sure I can tell the difference anymore." She explained Janet's offer while Will listened with the focused attention he usually reserved for board presentations, asking occasional clarifying questions, but mostly just letting her work through the implications out loud. "What do you want to do?" he asked when she finished. "That's the problem," Monica said. 6 months ago, if someone had offered me a permanent position with benefits and career advancement opportunities, I would have said yes before they finished explaining the details. Now, she gestured around the conference room that had become their unofficial shared space. "Now I'm not sure what I want, which is probably the least practical approach to career planning in recorded history. Maybe practical isn't the most important consideration," Will suggested. "Easy for you to say. You have enough money to buy practical if you decide you need it." Will was quiet for so long that Monica wondered if she'd accidentally insulted him. But when he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than offended. "You're right," he said. "I do have the luxury of making decisions based on what I want instead of what I need, and I forget sometimes that not everyone has that privilege. But Monica, you're good at what you do, really good. Good enough that companies are competing for your services. That's not a position of weakness, even if it feels uncertain." Monica watched Aiden navigate the slide with increasing confidence, each trip down representing a small victory in his ongoing campaign to master the relationship between gravity and fun. Maybe that was what growing up looked like, learning to trust that the world would hold you up, even when you couldn't see exactly where you were going to land. "I think," she said slowly, "that I want to finish this project first. See how it goes. Make decisions based on what actually happens instead of what I'm afraid might happen." "That sounds reasonable," Will said, though something in his expression suggested relief that she wasn't immediately accepting Janet's offer. "Plus," Monica added, grinning, "I'm pretty sure Aiden would never forgive me if I took him away from his slide before he's finished conducting all the necessary scientific research." "The slide is a significant factor in this decision," Will agreed solemnly. "It represents a substantial investment in ongoing research and development." As Monica returned to her work, she realized that maybe trust wasn't about having all the answers up front. Maybe it was about being willing to believe that good things could continue to happen, even when you couldn't control all the variables. Maybe it was about learning to distinguish between the kind of practical that protected you and the kind that limited you. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Janet. Think about it, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait forever. Monica glanced across the room at Will, who was now serving as chief architectural consultant for Aiden's block tower construction project, and typed back, "I'll let you know soon." Soon, she decided, was a beautifully flexible timeline that could accommodate both practical considerations and the possibility that the best decisions weren't always the most obvious ones. The revelation came disguised as a routine Google search, which was possibly the most mundane way for Monica's world to implode, since she'd started believing that maybe the universe wasn't entirely committed to using her for target practice. She'd been researching background information for the Anderson Industries environmental campaign, looking for data about the company's history of corporate acquisitions and subsidiary relationships, when she stumbled across a press release dated 8 months ago. The headline was innocuous enough. Anderson Industries streamlines operations through strategic partnership restructuring, which was the kind of corporate speak that usually meant someone was getting fired, but everyone was going to pretend it was a business opportunity. The details, however, made Monica's coffee cup slip from suddenly nerveless fingers. Anderson Industries announced today the dissolution of its partnership with Creative Solutions Marketing, citing a strategic realignment of vendor relationships and a shift toward in-house creative services. The decision affects approximately 40 employees at Creative Solutions Marketing's Portland location, with layoffs expected to begin within 60 days. Monica read the paragraph 3 times, because sometimes when reality decides to rearrange itself around you, the only response is repetition until the new information stops feeling like a foreign language. Then she read the date again, cross-referencing it with her own layoff timeline, and felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest like a piece of ice that refused to melt. Will Anderson, the man who had bought her groceries when she couldn't afford diapers, who had converted his conference room into a playground for her son, who had offered her the best job she'd had in years, was also the man whose business decisions had set in motion the chain of events that led to her counting coins in Henderson's grocery in the first place. The irony was so perfect it felt intentional, like the universe had been waiting months to deliver the punchline to a joke she hadn't realized she was part of. "Mama okay?" Aiden asked from his position at the toy kitchen, where he was conducting what appeared to be an important experiment in the optimal ratio of plastic vegetables to imaginary soup. "Mama's fine, baby," Monica said automatically, though she was pretty sure that was a lie. She was many things at the moment, shocked, confused, possibly approaching the early stages of what her therapist would have called a breakthrough in understanding family of origin patterns related to trust and abandonment. But fine wasn't one of them. Her phone buzzed with a text from Will, running late for our 2 p.m. meeting. Conference call with the Portland Development Project went long. Be there in 20 minutes. Monica stared at the message, trying to reconcile the casual intimacy of his communication style with the formal corporate language of the press release that was still glowing on her laptop screen. This was the same man who remembered that Aiden preferred animal-shaped crackers over regular ones, who had somehow procured a selection of toddler-appropriate books that rotated mysteriously every few days, who looked at her like she was someone worth knowing instead of someone worth helping. It was also the same man whose company had eliminated her previous job as part of a strategic realignment that had probably looked very reasonable on a spreadsheet, but had translated into 6 months of unemployment, food insecurity, and the particular desperation that came with trying to provide for a child when every safety net had holes big enough to fall through. The waiting was almost worse than the shock. Monica spent the next 20 minutes running through every conversation she'd had with Will, looking for signs that he'd known who she was all along, that their meeting at Henderson's grocery had been something other than the coincidence it had seemed at the time. But she couldn't find any evidence of deliberate deception, which somehow made it worse. If he'd known, At least that would have suggested he'd been thinking about her, even in a manipulative way. The possibility that he genuinely hadn't connected her to the marketing firm his company had cut loose was more unsettling than outright lies would have been. When Will finally appeared in the doorway of what had become their shared workspace, carrying coffee and wearing the slightly harried expression of someone whose day had been consumed by meetings that could have been emails, Monica felt something shift in her chest, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves around a fault line that had been invisible until the moment it cracked open. "Sorry I'm late," he said, settling into his usual chair and pulling out his phone to check for whatever crisis was next on his schedule. The Portland development team had some concerns about environmental impact assessments that required. "Monica, are you okay?" Monica realized she'd been staring at him with the kind of intensity usually reserved for trying to see through walls or read minds, and that her expression was probably broadcasting emotional distress in frequencies that even someone as oblivious as most men could pick up on. "Will," she said carefully, "because sometimes when you need to have conversations that might destroy everything good in your life, the only approach is slow and methodical, like defusing a bomb while wearing mittens. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Will's expression shifted from casual professional concern to something that looked almost like fear, and Monica realized that he'd probably been waiting for this conversation since the day they'd met, knowing that eventually the comfortable fiction they'd built around their relationship would collide with the complicated reality of who they actually were to each other. "Okay," he said simply. "Did you know?" Monica asked, gesturing toward her laptop screen, which was still displaying the press release that had rearranged her understanding of everything. "When you saw me in that grocery store, when you offered to pay for my groceries, when you hired me to work on your environmental campaign, did you know that I was laid off from Creative Solutions Marketing because your company ended their contract?" Will was quiet for so long that Monica could hear Aiden's quiet conversation with his plastic vegetables, the hum of the building's HVAC system, and what sounded like her own heart trying to break itself against her ribcage. "No," he said finally, and his voice carried the weight of someone delivering news that was going to hurt everyone involved. "I didn't know. Not until 2 weeks ago, when Janet Morrison mentioned your previous employment during a phone conversation about the contract renewal." 2 weeks ago, Monica repeated, because sometimes when people tell you things that reorganize your entire understanding of reality, the only response is to repeat key phrases until they stop sounding like foreign language. "I was going to tell you," Will continued quickly. "I've been trying to figure out how to bring it up without it sounding like this. Like a betrayal, or a lie, or some elaborate corporate conspiracy designed to make you feel grateful for opportunities you should have had anyway." Monica felt something that might have been laughter if it hadn't been so bitter, because the situation had moved beyond ironic and into the realm of cosmic joke. "So for 2 weeks you've known that you're essentially the reason I was in that grocery store, counting out my last dollar for diapers, and you just didn't mention it. What was I supposed to say?" Will asked, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked less like a confident CEO and more like someone who had made a series of decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but had accumulated into something inexcusable. "That I'm sorry my company's business decisions contributed to your financial difficulties. And by the way, would you like to grab coffee and pretend that power dynamic doesn't exist?" "You could have started with the truth," Monica said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded despite the fact that her internal emotional landscape currently resembled a natural disaster zone. "You could have said, I just realized that my company's business decisions affected your previous employment, and I want to make sure you're comfortable with this professional relationship given that context." And if you'd said you weren't comfortable? If you'd decided that working for the company that eliminated your previous job was too complicated or ethically problematic? Monica considered the question, trying to imagine how she would have responded to that conversation 2 weeks ago, before she'd gotten used to financial security, and Aiden had gotten attached to his slide, and she'd started thinking of Will as something more complicated than either a professional colleague or a wealthy benefactor. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I would have appreciated having the choice." Will nodded slowly, like someone accepting a verdict that was fair but painful. You're right. I should have told you as soon as I realized the connection. I was being selfish, wanting to preserve what we'd built without having to deal with the complications. Aidan chose that moment to wander over from his toy kitchen, apparently having reached some important culinary conclusion that required adult consultation. Mama, Will, soup ready, he announced, offering them each a plastic bowl filled with an assortment of toy vegetables that had been arranged with the artistic sensibility of someone who understood that presentation mattered. Monica watched Will accept the imaginary soup with the same focused attention he brought to board presentations, and felt her anger complicate itself with the kind of affection that made everything harder instead of easier. This is delicious, Will told Aidan solemnly. Is that carrot I taste? Carrot and potato and... Aidan paused, clearly searching for the most important ingredient. Love. Ah, Will said, nodding seriously. Love is the secret ingredient in all the best recipes. Monica felt something crack open in her chest, watching this interaction between the man who had inadvertently caused her months of financial desperation and the child who had never learned to question whether the adults in his life would provide what he needed. The situation was absurd and heartbreaking and complicated in ways that probably required advanced degrees in psychology and philosophy to untangle properly. We need to talk about this, she said after Aidan had returned to his kitchen to begin work on what appeared to be a dessert course. Really talk about it, not just acknowledge it and move on. I know, Will replied. And Monica, whatever you decide about us, about this job, about any of it, I want you to know that what happened at the grocery store wasn't some elaborate corporate guilt management strategy. I saw someone who needed help, and I helped because it felt like the right thing to do, not because I knew anything about your employment history. Monica believed him, which somehow made everything more complicated instead of less. If he'd known who she was, if their meeting had been calculated rather than coincidental, she could have been angry in a clean, uncomplicated way. Instead, she was dealing with the messy reality that good intentions and harmful impacts could coexist in the same space, that people could hurt each other without meaning to and help each other without understanding the full context of what help was needed. I need some time, she said finally, to process this, to figure out what it means, to decide how I feel about working for the company that's indirectly responsible for the worst 6 months of my adult life. How much time? Will asked. Monica looked around the conference room that had become their shared space, at the slide that had been installed for Aidan's entertainment, at the view of Portland that had started to feel like home instead of just a place where she lived. She thought about Janet Morrison's offer to return to creative solutions marketing, about the security of permanent employment versus the uncertainty of consulting work, about the difference between practical decisions and decisions that honored what she actually wanted. I'll let you know, she said, which was the most honest answer she could give to a question that didn't have any easy answers. As Will gathered his things and prepared to leave, giving her the space she'd asked for, Monica realized that maybe trust wasn't about the absence of complications. Maybe it was about being willing to navigate the complications together, to have conversations that hurt and make decisions that required courage, to choose relationship over simplicity, even when simplicity would have been so much easier. But first, she needed to figure out whether the relationship they'd built was strong enough to survive the weight of everything they hadn't said to each other from the beginning. Mama sad? Aidan asked, appearing at her side with the intuitive understanding that toddlers sometimes displayed about adult emotional states. Mama's thinking, Monica replied, which was true enough. Thinking about grown-up stuff that's complicated. Thinking hard. Very hard, Monica confirmed. Aidan nodded sympathetically and returned to his toy kitchen, apparently satisfied that thinking hard was a reasonable adult activity that didn't require his immediate intervention. Monica watched him play and tried to decide whether the past few months had been a fairy tale with a happy ending or a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting people whose personal kindness couldn't erase the systemic harm of their professional decisions. The answer, she was beginning to realize might be both. Monica spent 3 days avoiding her own life with the dedication of someone who had elevated procrastination to an art form. She dropped Aiden off at the community center daycare, a luxury she could now afford thanks to Will's consulting contract, which felt like cosmic irony wrapped in practical convenience, and drove aimlessly around Portland, visiting coffee shops where she didn't have to pretend to work and walking through parks where 2-year-olds weren't allowed to test the structural integrity of playground equipment. The problem with avoiding your problems, Monica discovered, was that they had a tendency to follow you around like persistent salespeople who refused to accept that you weren't interested in whatever they were offering. Every coffee shop reminded her of the one where she and Will had their first real conversation. Every park bench made her think about the financial security that had allowed her to consider leisure time instead of treating every moment as a potential income-generating opportunity. By Thursday morning, she'd reached the conclusion that she was being ridiculous, a grown woman hiding from a conversation that needed to happen, as if avoiding Will would somehow make the complicated reality of their relationship disappear through sheer force of emotional avoidance. She was sitting in her car outside Henderson's grocery, staring at the fluorescent-lit entrance where her life had taken an unexpected turn exactly 7 weeks ago, when her phone rang with a call from her mother. "Monica, honey." Patricia Brown's voice carried the particular mixture of concern and judgment that had defined most of their interactions since Monica's divorce. "I just got off the phone with your Aunt Carol, and she mentioned that you've been doing well at some new job. Something about marketing consulting." Monica closed her eyes and prepared herself for a conversation that would require her to explain her current circumstances to someone who had spent Monica's entire adult life offering unsolicited advice about her career choices, relationship decisions, and parenting strategies. "Yes, Mom. I'm working on a contract with a company here in Portland. It's going well." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. And this is a stable position? With benefits and a future?" "It's complicated," Monica said, because explaining the professional and personal complexities of her relationship with Will Anderson to her mother was approximately as appealing as performing dental surgery on herself with a spoon. "Complicated how?" "Monica, you know I worry about you and Aiden. You need security, not more complications." Monica felt the familiar twist in her chest that came from hearing her own fears reflected back to her in her mother's voice. Patricia Brown had raised 3 children as a single mother after Monica's father died when Monica was 12, and security had become the lens through which she viewed every major life decision. It was practical advice born from hard experience, but it also felt like a limitation Monica wasn't sure she wanted to accept. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course, honey. When you were my age, when you were raising us kids on your own, did you ever have opportunities that felt right but looked risky? Chances to do something that mattered to you, even if it wasn't the safest choice?" Patricia was quiet for so long that Monica wondered if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a wistfulness that Monica rarely heard from her practical, no-nonsense mother. "I had a chance to go back to school," Patricia said slowly. "When you kids were in elementary school, there was a nursing program that offered evening classes, and I could have gotten financial aid to cover most of the tuition. I'd always wanted to be a nurse, even before I married your father. What happened? I decided it was too risky. Going to school while working full-time and raising 3 kids seemed impossible, and nursing school was competitive. What if I couldn't handle the coursework? What if something happened to my job while I was distracted by classes? What if? Patricia sighed. "I chose the safe option, and I don't regret it exactly. We got by fine, and you kids turned out well. But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd been a little braver." Monica felt something shift in her understanding of her mother's advice, realizing that Patricia's emphasis on security came not just from practical wisdom, but from the particular regret that comes from choosing safety over possibility. "Mom, the job situation here. It's complicated because it involves someone I care about, and there are professional dynamics that make the personal stuff difficult to navigate. But the work itself is the best I've ever done, and it feels like it matters in ways that most marketing jobs don't. And the someone you care about? Monica smiled despite everything, because her mother had always been able to identify the emotional center of any situation with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. He's a good man who made some business decisions that affected my life before we knew each other. He's trying to do the right thing now, but it's messy because power dynamics and personal feelings don't mix well in professional contexts. Honey, Patricia said gently, life is messy. The question isn't whether you can avoid complications. It's whether the complications are worth navigating for what you might find on the other side. After they hung up, Monica sat in her car outside Henderson's grocery for another 20 minutes, watching people come and go with their shopping lists and their everyday problems, their children in tow and their tired faces illuminated by fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. She thought about the woman she'd been 7 weeks ago, counting out coins and trying to figure out how to provide something as basic as diapers for her son. That woman would have been grateful for any opportunity that offered financial stability, would have accepted Janet Morrison's offer to return to Creative Solutions marketing without hesitation, would have chosen security over uncertainty every single time. But that woman also hadn't known what it felt like to do work that mattered, to have professional relationships that respected both her expertise and her parental responsibilities, to be part of something that felt like collaboration rather than just employment. That woman hadn't known Will Anderson, hadn't watched him install playground equipment in a conference room because he understood that good childcare policies were more than abstract corporate benefits, hadn't seen him accept imaginary soup from her toddler with the same focused attention he brought to million-dollar business decisions. Monica started her car and drove to Anderson Industries, because some conversations were too important to avoid and some decisions were too significant to make from a place of fear rather than clarity. The 37th floor felt different when she stepped off the elevator, not less familiar, but charged with the particular energy that came from knowing that everything was about to change one way or another. Will's assistant wasn't at her desk, and the hallway leading to what had become their shared conference room felt longer than usual, like walking toward a destination that would determine the trajectory of everything that came next. She found Will sitting at the small table where they'd had coffee and conversations about everything except the professional complications that had brought them together. He was reading through what appeared to be a stack of legal documents, but he looked up when she entered with an expression that managed to be both hopeful and terrified. "You came back," he said, and his voice carried the particular relief of someone who had been preparing for bad news, but hoping for something different. "We need to finish our conversation," Monica replied, settling into the chair across from him, while Aidan immediately beelined for his slide with the focused determination of someone who had important playground-related research to complete. "I've been thinking," Will said, "about what you said, about choice and honesty, and the fact that I should have told you about the Creative Solutions marketing connection as soon as I realized it existed. And I think the reason I didn't tell you wasn't because I was trying to protect our working relationship, or because I thought you couldn't handle the information. I think it was because I was afraid that if you knew the truth about how we're connected, you'd see our entire relationship as some elaborate corporate guilt management strategy instead of what it actually is." Monica felt her chest tighten with something that might have been hope if she'd been brave enough to call it that. "What is it actually?" Will was quiet for a long moment, watching Aidan navigate the slide with increasing confidence, his small face lit up with the particular joy that came from mastering something that had seemed impossible just a few weeks ago. "It's the first time in 18 months that I've woken up looking forward to something other than work," Will said finally. "It's watching you handle single motherhood and career rebuilding with more grace than I've ever managed to handle quarterly board meetings. It's Aidan calling me Will, and offering me plastic soup and making me remember what it feels like to be part of something that matters more than profit margins." Monica felt tears threaten to spill over, but she blinked them back because some conversations were too important to blur with crying. "Will, The fact that you didn't cause my unemployment on purpose doesn't change the fact that your company's business decisions contributed to 6 months of financial desperation that you can't imagine and I can't forget. I know, Will said simply. And I know that there's no way for me to undo that, or to separate my personal feelings from the professional power dynamics that exist between us. But Monica, I need you to know that what I feel for you has nothing to do with guilt or charity or corporate social responsibility. It has to do with the fact that you're brilliant and funny and brave, and watching you work is like watching someone discover that they're capable of things they hadn't imagined. What exactly are you saying? Monica asked, because sometimes when conversations reach the point where everything hangs in the balance, the only response is to ask for clarity that cuts through all the careful diplomatic language. I'm saying that I'm in love with you, Will replied, and the words hit the room like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that changed everything they touched. I'm in love with you, and with the way Aiden looks at the world like it's full of interesting possibilities, and with the life we've been building together in this ridiculous conference room that's become the most important space in my entire building. Monica felt the world rearrange itself around her, like furniture being moved in a room she'd learned to navigate in the dark. This was what she'd been afraid of, and what she'd been hoping for, and what she'd been trying not to want, because wanting things that seemed impossible was a luxury she'd learned she couldn't afford. I'm in love with you too, she said, and the admission felt like jumping off a cliff while hoping someone had remembered to install a safety net. Which is why this is all so complicated. Because I can't tell where my feelings end and my gratitude begins, and I can't separate what I want from what I need. And I don't know how to love someone whose professional decisions have that much power over my life. Then let's change that, Will said. Let's figure out how to build something that doesn't depend on me being your employer or you being my consultant. Let's find a way to be together that honors what we both need without requiring either of us to pretend that the power dynamics don't exist. Monica looked around the conference room that had become their shared space, at the slide that Will had installed, because he understood that good relationships required practical solutions to everyday problems, at Aiden playing contentedly in an environment where he was welcomed rather than tolerated. She thought about Janet Morrison's offer, about the security of permanent employment versus the uncertainty of building something new. She thought about her mother's advice about choosing possibility over safety, about the difference between complications that were worth navigating and complications that were just obstacles in disguise. What did you have in mind? She asked. Will's smile was the first completely unguarded expression she'd seen from him since their conversation about creative solutions marketing had complicated everything between them. I have some ideas, he said. But I think they're the kind of ideas that require input from someone who's good at creative problem solving and understands both marketing strategy and the practical challenges of single parenthood. That sounds like a job description, Monica said, grinning despite everything. It sounds like a partnership, Will corrected. If you're interested. Monica looked at Aiden, who had paused in his slide-related research to offer his giraffe toy a turn down the slide, because 2-year-olds understood that the best adventures were the ones you shared with someone you loved. I'm interested, she said, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in years. 6 months later, Monica stood in front of the bathroom mirror in Will's penthouse apartment. Their penthouse apartment, she corrected herself, though the adjustment from his space that I sometimes sleep in to our home where we're building a life together still felt surreal enough to require conscious mental recalibration, trying to zip up a dress that had seemed much more cooperative when she'd bought it 3 weeks ago. Mama pretty, Aiden announced from his position on the bathroom counter, where he was conducting what appeared to be an important investigation into the optimal application of toothpaste to every surface within arm's reach. Thank you, baby, Monica replied, finally achieving victory over the zipper and turning to survey the damage Aiden had inflicted on the previously pristine marble countertop. But I think you're prettier, covered in mint-flavored bathroom decor. The toothpaste situation was a direct result of Will's well-intentioned, but ultimately misguided decision to let Aiden help with his morning routine, which had resulted in what looked like a small explosion in a dental hygiene factory. Monica had learned to find these domestic disasters charming rather than frustrating, mostly because watching Will navigate the reality of living with a toddler was endlessly entertaining for someone who had spent years managing similar chaos alone. Will. Aiden called, apparently deciding that the toothpaste experiment required adult supervision. Come see. Will appeared in the bathroom doorway, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than Monica's car, and an expression of mild horror as he surveyed the artistic vision Aiden had created using crest whitening formula and determination. That's very creative, buddy, Will said diplomatically. Very abstract expressionist. I think Picasso would be impressed. Picasso probably never had to clean toothpaste out of marble grout, Monica observed, wetting a washcloth and beginning the restoration process. Though if he had, we might have gotten some interesting insights into the relationship between domestic responsibility and artistic inspiration. They developed this routine over the past 6 months. The comfortable rhythm of shared parenting responsibilities and bathroom counter-negotiations that came with combining 2 previously separate lives into something that resembled a functional family unit. It wasn't always smooth, and it definitely wasn't always elegant, but it was theirs in a way that felt both surprising and inevitable. Tonight was the launch party for Brown Anderson Creative Solutions, the consulting firm they'd established after Monica had turned down both Janet Morrison's job offer and Will's initial proposal that she simply become a permanent Anderson Industries employee. The compromise they'd reached was typically complicated and typically them. Monica would maintain her independence as a business owner, while Will provided startup capital and office space, creating a partnership that was both professional and personal without requiring either of them to sacrifice their individual identities for the sake of relationship harmony. The firm had already landed 3 major clients, including 2 companies that had specifically sought them out after hearing about their work on Anderson Industries' environmental campaign. Monica was doing the kind of creative, socially conscious marketing work she'd dreamed about when she first got into the field, and Will had discovered that being a silent partner in a small business was significantly more satisfying than managing a corporate empire that ran itself with minimal input from him. You ready for tonight? Will asked, helping Monica wrangle Aiden into his tiny tuxedo, which had been custom-made by someone who apparently understood that formal wear for toddlers needed to accommodate both dignity and the inevitable requirements of playground physics. As ready as I can be for an evening where I have to convince Portland's business elite that I'm a serious professional while my 2-year-old serves as my unofficial co-host, Monica replied, adjusting Aiden's bow tie, which he immediately tried to eat. He's going to be the star of the show, Will said confidently. Half the people coming tonight are parents. They'll be charmed by his complete inability to care about networking protocols. The launch party was being held at the Portland Art Museum, in a space that managed to be both elegant and welcoming. Important qualities for an event designed to introduce Brown Anderson Creative Solutions to potential clients, while also celebrating the unconventional family they'd become in the process of building a business together. Monica's mother had flown in from Sacramento, wearing her best dress, and the expression of someone who was still trying to process how her daughter's life had transformed from cautionary tale about the dangers of divorce and unemployment to heartwarming success story involving love and professional fulfillment. Patricia Brown had spent the morning playing with Aiden while asking Monica careful questions about Will's intentions and the long-term stability of their arrangement, as if happiness were a commodity that needed to be quality tested before it could be trusted. He seems like a good man, Patricia had said finally, watching Will attempt to teach Aiden how to tie his shoes with the focused concentration of someone tackling a complex engineering problem. And he looks at you like you're something precious that he can't quite believe he gets to keep. Mom, Monica had replied, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. That's very romantic, but we're business partners first. The personal stuff it's complicated. Honey, Patricia had said, smiling with the wisdom of someone who had learned to recognize love in all its various disguises. The best relationships are always complicated. Simple is for people who don't care enough about each other to do the hard work of figuring out how to make things work. Now, standing in the museum's main gallery, surrounded by Portland's business community, and watching will give a speech about the importance of authentic corporate messaging, while Aidan sat on his shoulders providing commentary that only he could understand, Monica realized that her mother had been right. Simple would have been easier, but it wouldn't have been this. This collection of people who had somehow become family, this work that felt like purpose rather than just employment, this life that was messy and complicated and more satisfying than anything she'd imagined when she was counting coins in Henderson's grocery. Ladies and gentlemen, Will was saying, I'd like you to meet my business partner, Monica Brown, whose vision for socially conscious marketing has already changed how Anderson Industries thinks about corporate responsibility, and whose ability to manage creative projects while simultaneously preventing a toddler from redesigning office furniture has convinced me that she can handle any client we throw at her. Monica stepped forward to polite applause, feeling Aidan reach for her from his perch on Will's shoulders, and took the microphone with hands that only shook slightly. Thank you, she said, settling Aidan on her hip in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. 6 months ago, I was unemployed, behind on rent, and counting out grocery money while trying to figure out how to provide for my son. Tonight, I'm launching a business with the man who bought my groceries that night, and somehow convinced me that trust was something I could afford after all. She could see people in the audience exchanging glances, probably trying to figure out whether she was delivering a professional presentation or sharing details from her personal life that were more appropriate for therapy sessions than business launches. The thing about authentic marketing, Monica continued, is that it requires you to be honest about where you've been and what you've learned along the way. Brown Anderson Creative Solutions exists because we believe that the best corporate messaging comes from understanding that businesses are made up of people, and people's stories are complicated and messy and beautiful in ways that can't be captured by traditional advertising strategies. She looked out at the crowd of potential clients and professional contacts, people whose opinions could determine the success or failure of the business she'd spent months building, and made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Our company's origin story involves a grocery store checkout line, a pack of diapers, and the kind of kindness that changes everything. We're going to tell that story to clients who want to understand how authentic human connections translate into effective marketing campaigns. And we're going to do it while raising a 2-year-old who believes that conference rooms should have slides and that the best meetings include snack time and mandatory nap time for everyone involved. The applause that followed was warmer than polite professional acknowledgement, and Monica realized that maybe authenticity wasn't just a marketing strategy. Maybe it was a way of living that attracted people who valued honesty over convenience, substance over simplicity. After the formal presentations ended, and the evening shifted into the kind of networking conversations that Monica had once dreaded, but now found surprisingly manageable, she found herself standing near the museum's windows with Will, watching Aidan charm a group of business executives by offering them imaginary cookies from his toy kitchen, which someone had thoughtfully brought from the office. Think it went well? Will asked, loosening his bow tie with the relief of someone who had successfully completed a social obligation that required him to be charming and professional for 3 consecutive hours. I think we convinced Portland's business community that we're either brilliantly innovative or completely insane, Monica replied. Possibly both. Both is good. Both means we're memorable. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their strange little family interact with people who represented the professional future they were building together. Patricia Brown was deep in conversation with Margaret Chen from Anderson Industries board, apparently bonding over their shared experiences of raising strong-willed children. Aidan was conducting what appeared to be a very serious consultation with the museum's catering manager about optimal cookie distribution strategies. Monica, Will said quietly, and something in his tone made her turn to look at him more carefully. There's something I want to ask you, and I need you to know that it doesn't have anything to do with business partnership agreements or corporate strategic planning. Monica felt her chest tighten with anticipation, because she'd learned to recognize the particular quality of Will's voice when he was about to say something that would rearrange her understanding of their relationship. "What is it?" she asked. Will reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, and Monica felt the world tilt sideways in the way that had become familiar whenever the universe decided to surprise her with possibilities she hadn't been brave enough to imagine. "I know this is complicated," Will said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone who had rehearsed this conversation, but was discovering that reality was different from practice. "I know we have professional obligations and parental responsibilities, and about 17 different reasons why this might be the worst timing in recorded history. But Monica, I don't want to be your business partner who you happen to sleep with, or your boyfriend who happens to share office space with you. I want to be your husband and Aiden's stepfather, and the person you build a life with that's intentional instead of accidental." Monica stared at the ring box, trying to process the fact that Will Anderson, successful CEO, confirmed bachelor, man who had once described marriage as a legal contract that complicated otherwise functional relationships, was proposing to her in the middle of their business launch party while their toddler conducted cookie negotiations in the background. "Will," she said carefully, "are you sure this isn't some elaborate expression of corporate merger instincts? Because I should probably mention that I'm not a business asset that can be acquired through strategic planning and good intentions." Will's laugh was the sound of relief mixed with genuine amusement. "Monica, you are the least acquirable person I've ever met. You're stubborn and independent and completely unwilling to compromise your principles for convenience, which is exactly why I want to marry you instead of just living with you and hoping this all works out somehow. And Aiden is the best thing that's ever happened to either of us," Will said simply. "He taught me that love isn't something you have to earn or deserve. It's something you give and receive, because that's what makes life worth living. I want to adopt him officially, if you'll let me. I want us to be a family in all the ways that matter, legal and emotional, and completely, ridiculously committed to figuring out how to make this work." Monica looked across the room at Aiden, who had apparently reached some important agreement with the catering staff, and was now teaching a group of business executives how to properly appreciate imaginary cookies. He looked happy and secure, and completely confident that the adults in his life would provide whatever he needed, whenever he needed it. She thought about the woman she'd been 8 months ago, counting out grocery money, and trying to figure out how to survive another day of single parenthood and unemployment. That woman would have been terrified of accepting help that came with emotional complications, would have chosen security over uncertainty every single time, would have seen marriage as either a fairy tale or a trap, but never as a practical solution to the logistics of building a life together. But that woman hadn't known Will Anderson, hadn't experienced the particular kind of partnership that came from finding someone who wanted to solve problems with you instead of for you, hadn't discovered that trust was something you could build gradually, one conversation at a time, until you woke up one day and realized you'd created something worth protecting. "Yes," Monica said, and the word felt like jumping off a cliff while knowing that someone was waiting to catch you. "Yes, I'll marry you, and yes, you can adopt Aiden, and yes, we can figure out how to be a family while running a business together, and probably driving each other crazy in ways we haven't even discovered yet." Will's smile was bright enough to power the entire museum, and he was reaching for her hand to slide the ring onto her finger when Aiden appeared at their side, apparently having concluded his cookie consultations and decided that the grown-ups needed his immediate attention. Will, Mama," Aiden said seriously, tugging on Monica's dress and Will's jacket with the focused determination of someone who had important information to share. "Cookie Lady says we can have cake too. Big cake. For party." "That sounds perfect, buddy," Will said, scooping Aiden up with one arm while keeping his other hand firmly clasped in Monica's. "This is definitely a cake-worthy celebration." As they stood there in the Portland Art Museum, surrounded by business associates who were probably wondering why the evening's networking event had suddenly turned into what appeared to be an engagement announcement, Monica realized that maybe the best decisions were the ones that felt both terrifying and inevitable, complicated and simple, practical and completely impractical, all at the same time. The ring Will had chosen was beautiful, but not ostentatious, elegant, but not impractical. The kind of jewelry that suggested he'd been paying attention to her preferences, even when she hadn't realized she was expressing them. It fit perfectly, which was probably some sort of metaphor for their entire relationship, though Monica was too happy to spend time analyzing the symbolism. "Ladies and gentlemen," Will announced to the room at large, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was accustomed to making important announcements, but had never made one that mattered quite this much. "It appears that Brown Anderson Creative Solutions is about to become a family business in the most literal sense possible." The applause that followed was enthusiastic enough to suggest that Portland's business community appreciated authentic human drama more than Monica had expected, and she found herself surrounded by people offering congratulations and asking about wedding dates and timeline expectations, as if she'd just announced a merger rather than an engagement. "When?" asked Margaret Chen, beaming with the satisfaction of someone who had clearly seen this development coming from months away. "Soon," Monica replied, because she'd learned that the best plans were often the ones that left room for spontaneity and the particular chaos that came with organizing major life events around the schedule of a 2-year-old who had strong opinions about optimal celebration protocols. "Very soon," Will agreed, bouncing Aiden gently while their son examined the engagement ring with the focused concentration of someone conducting important jewelry quality assessment research. "But first, I believe someone mentioned cake." As the evening wound down, and guests began to leave with business cards and promises to schedule follow-up meetings about potential consulting projects, Monica found herself standing in the museum's lobby with her newly expanded family, trying to process everything that had changed in the space of a few hours. 8 months ago, she'd been a broke single mother counting coins in a grocery store checkout line, convinced that her life had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting the universe to provide what you needed when you needed it. Tonight, she was an engaged business owner with a consulting firm, a fiancé who understood that love was something you built through daily choices rather than grand gestures, and a son who had never learned to doubt that the adults in his life would figure out how to make everything work. The transformation felt too dramatic to be real, like a fairy tale that someone had adapted for people who preferred their happy endings to come with realistic complications and practical solutions to everyday problems. "Ready to go home?" Will asked, helping Monica gather the detritus that always seemed to accumulate around Aiden. Toys and jackets, and the portable high chair that had become their constant companion at any social event lasting longer than 20 minutes. "Ready," Monica replied, taking Aiden's hand while Will managed the logistics of coats and business materials, and the thank you notes they'd need to write to everyone who had helped make the evening successful. As they walked toward the museum's exit, Monica realized that maybe the best love stories weren't the ones that ended with wedding bells and happily ever after. Maybe they were the ones that began with two people discovering that they were brave enough to choose each other, again and again, through all the complicated realities of building a life together. Maybe they were the ones that started in grocery store checkout lines and conference rooms converted into playgrounds, with toddlers who believed that love was something you shared like imaginary soup, with people who understood that the best partnerships were the ones where everyone got to be themselves while becoming part of something larger than what they could create alone. "Mama," Aiden said as they reached the parking lot, tugging on Monica's dress with the urgency of someone who had just remembered something crucial. "We forgot Giraffe." Monica smiled, realizing that some things never changed, that no matter how much their lives transformed, there would always be forgotten toys and last-minute crises, and the particular chaos that came with loving someone whose priorities were beautifully, completely different from adult concerns about timing and appropriateness. "Don't worry, baby," she said, unlocking the car door and helping him into his car seat. "Giraffe is safe at home, waiting for us, just like everything else we need." As they drove through Portland's evening traffic toward the penthouse apartment that had somehow become home, Monica realized that maybe that was what family actually meant. Not perfection, but the promise that someone would always be waiting for you, ready to help you find whatever you'd forgotten, ready to build tomorrow around the things that mattered most, ready to choose love again and again, even when it was complicated, especially when it was complicated. The end. Monica's journey from counting coins at a grocery checkout to building a successful business with the man who changed her life shows us how sometimes our biggest challenges can lead to our greatest opportunities. When has a difficult situation in your own life unexpectedly opened doors you never saw coming? Share your story in the comments below. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.